To see some young people here today. I'll be 161 later this month. I'm here to make everyone feel young. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my dear friend, the president of the Oregon Historical Society, Mr. Kerry Timchik.
Thank you.
Well, good morning and thanks for turning out. This is the 8th year that I've been able to travel the state with President Roosevelt, courtesy of our good friends at Wells Fargo Bank. They're the official sponsor of the Teddy Roosevelt Roadshow. And for 8 years, we've taken Teddy around the state, going to schools and historical societies, at no cost to them because Wells Fargo sponsors it, and bringing history alive to our schools and bringing history alive to museums. And just right before we came here, we had a late request to go to the Juvenile Detention Center, where President Roosevelt met with about 15 to 20 young kids who have made a wrong choice, but are trying to get better. And they asked President Roosevelt to come in and inspire them, and it was really inspiring. And they all asked amazing questions too. So,
if I may, they inspired me today.
So you have a tough act to follow because you got to ask as good a questions as they did. So you know who this guy is. He is one of the most well-known American presidents. His face is on Mount Rushmore, of course. He has played many roles in his remarkable life. He was a cowboy for a while in the Dakotas, of course. He was a state legislator in New York. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was Governor of New York. He was Vice President of the United States. And he was President of the United States all by the time he was 42 years old.
It was a pretty good start.
The youngest president ever. But most known, of course, for being the 26th President of the United States. And this is not his first time in Salem. He'll tell you that he was here in 1903.
Correct.
1903.
Visited the state capitol building.
Visited the state capitol building, which is, of course, on this location, much different looking, different building.
Hosted by Mayor Bishop of the Pendleton Wool family.
He was mayor of Salem at the time. But join me in welcoming back to the Oregon State Capitol 116 years later, after he was here the first time, President Teddy Roosevelt.
Thank you, Mr. Timchik. Thank you all one and all. I am Theodore Roosevelt, and I'm delighted to be back in Oregon. And we've been enjoying the hospitality of the schools and community organizations in Portland. But Mr. Timchik, since he's taken the helm at the Oregon Historical Society some nearly 10 years ago, he wanted to make sure that the people of Oregon understand that it's not the Portland Historical Society, it's the Oregon Historical Society. So I thank the Oregon Historical Society and Wells Fargo, the sponsor of our travels every year, for giving me the opportunity to return. And most especially, I'm thankful that today we have young people with us. And of course, I'm speaking about your new Secretary of State, Secretary Clarno. We've got some young people here. And your good deputy, good to see you all. Now, I'm going to be, as I mentioned, 161 later this month, so everyone should feel young by comparison, but especially to see the most important crop in Oregon. Oh, you are a greenhouse to the country. We all enjoy your fruit and your filbert nuts, your wheat and your ryegrass, but it's the children that are the most important crop, and you're doing as fine a job as can be done in the nation. I'd like to thank you for welcoming me. Wherever we've gone in the state of Oregon, I've been recognized, and people greet me accordingly. They say, "Good morning, Teddy," or "Hello, Mr. President." My friends, after my retirement from the presidency, called me Colonel. For my brief time in the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, history remembers us as the Rough Riders in the cause of Cuba Libre. All of those greetings, historically accurate, stand in such stark contrast to the one young man that saw me in Portland this morning. I had my top hat. He pointed at me and told his friends, he said, "Look, there's the Monopoly dude." And if he knew his history as well as these fine students here, he would have known I was the anti-Monopoly dude, the great trustbuster. My legacy is alive and well, I think, in Oregon. I'm given credit for the national parks, perhaps too much credit. It took an act of Congress to name a national park. On this issue of the conservation of our natural resources, I was a progressive. And I discovered that all too often the opposite of progress was Congress. Well, it was my own fellow Republican, Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon of Danville, Illinois, who famously said, "Not 1 cent for scenery." Well, you in Oregon know that the national parks are not just scenery. They're the nation's playgrounds and wild places, organized on the most democratic of principles. The national parks belong to you. They belong to you. They belong to even the littlest one on our lap. And hence to each and all of us the responsibility to pass these parks on to future generations in better condition than we found them and not in worse. So I doubled the number of national parks from 5 to 10, and my first, in 1902, Crater Lake National Park here in Oregon. The deepest natural lake in North America, 1,942 feet deep. An ancient volcano collapsed in its cone and filled by eons of melted snow. And of course, I can't take credit for having the park named. That was a Portland businessman, a journalist, a man named William Gladstone Steele, who dedicated 3 decades of his life. Any important prominent citizen that came to Portland, he would bring them down to Crater Lake. He saw, as a founder of the Mazamas, that an annual alpine mountain convention was held at Crater Lake and spread the word about how this land should be preserved for future generations. I could, by executive order, name national monuments and bird sanctuaries. It was in the latter case that I've got some legacy here in Oregon. At the turn of the century, now 120 years ago or so, times were very different, as were fashions. There was something going on in Florida, along the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast and on up through the Atlantic of Georgia and South Carolina. Millions of nesting birds were being slaughtered and their nestlings left to starve. All that women might wear the feathers of those dead birds on their hats and on their dresses, sometimes wearing entire dead birds as adornment. There's no explaining fashion. But greed is easily understandable. An ounce of white egret feathers was worth more than an ounce of gold. And so men who were plume hunters, and we should really call them what they were, criminals, poachers, they slaughtered these birds. The Ornithological Union, the Audubon Society, my friend Frank Chapman, the head ornithologist at the American Museum of Natural History, they all deluged me with letters from Florida demanding that we do something to save these birds. I asked my Attorney General, was there anything in the laws or the Constitution of the United States which would expressly prohibit me from naming Pelican Island, a small mangrove island off the coast of the Atlantic in Florida, the last nesting place on the Atlantic of the brown pelican? Was there anything that would prohibit me from naming that island a federal bird sanctuary? The Attorney General hemmed and hawed and said, there's no express prohibition. I said, I thus declare it. The first of 51 bird sanctuaries declared during my administration. And have any of you here in Oregon ever been to Three Arches Rock? Have you been to Lower Klamath Falls? Have you been to Malheur National Wildlife Refuge? Of course, it's in the latter that we're reminded it's not just the wildlife that seeks refuge there. You've been much in the news for Malheur, haven't you? It reminds me of what I warned the American people. Avoid participating in the lunatic fringe. In any case, the credit for the refuges here, the sanctuaries, doesn't go to me. It goes to men like William Finley, his wife Irene, a groundbreaking woman in the area of photography, Herman Bollman. They made pictures and sent those pictures around the country. Mr. Finley came to the White House and had a picture show where I saw the pictures of his tufted puffins up at Three Arches Rock. And so in 1907, I named Three Arches Rock the first federal bird sanctuary west of the Mississippi River. But in each of these cases, Crater Lake National Park, your bird sanctuaries, it just proves that it's not just the president to whom we should look or Congress to whom we should look to do the good deeds of this country. They're done by you, by average, ordinary Oregonians every day to make this state and this country a better place, to leave your campground cleaner than you found it. Now, you may bristle. One senator of the White House, he bristled at my moralizing. He said, Mr. President, you're preaching. I said, Senator, you're right. And the presidency is a bully pulpit, too. Another of the phrases I've left behind. As we did with the youngsters today, I wanted to share, especially with the young people here, a few stories from my own youth that you might have some encouragement. I famously came from a rather wealthy family in New York City. But wealth does not protect one from the hardships and hazards of life. You might know that as a little boy, when I was growing up in New York City, I was a very weak and sickly child. I had asthma. Any of you who has asthma, or if you have asthma amongst your family or friends, you might know what a terrible disease that is. To see a small child choking for breath and for life itself. My asthma so bad that when I was 3-4 years old, when I could not even gather the breath to blow out the candle beside my bed, I would hear my parents speaking as if I might die in the night. The treatment for asthma today, thankfully, is the inhaler. The inhaler hopefully restores breath quickly during an asthma attack. In my day, we had no such treatment. In my day, the treatment for asthma was worse than the disease. Can you imagine giving a small asthmatic boy a cigar to smoke? The idea was that coughing would stimulate my breathing. I was given bitter black coffee to drink, again as a stimulant. Became quite addicted to the bean as an adult, drinking 1.5 gallons of coffee each and every day. I also was given ipecac syrup to drink. And, I see by the grimaces and hear by the groans, some of you are of an age, those with a bit of snow atop the peak, or not too much atop the peak, you know ipecac syrup. The younger generation generally knows it no longer. Ipecac syrup is something that you drink in order to see your lunch. Twice. Unpleasant memories for me to this very day. When I was a little boy of 11, still so much weaker and smaller than the other boys my age, my father, Theodore Roosevelt, the man for whom I'm named and the greatest man I ever knew, he called me into his study for a heart-to-heart talk. I knew the seriousness of the subject to follow, for rather than calling me by the diminutive nickname by which I was known in the family, T.D., he said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. And without the aid of the body, the mind cannot go as far as otherwise should. It is hard work and drudgery, but you must make your body." I said, "Father, I shall." And I set out to make my body with calisthenics. I lifted weights, I swam, I rowed, I worked on the parallel bars and on the rings. I even took boxing lessons in the classical manner. And I built my body. And it does appear I may have overdone it just a bit. But when I was your president at 5'8" and 220 solid pounds, I was but a mere feather of a man compared to my successor, William Howard Taft. At times, President Taft tipped the scales at over 350 pounds. And yes, it's true, he once got stuck in the White House bathtub. When I was a little boy, I did not attend a fine school or academy, as I assume most of our students today do. I was homeschooled. And in the parlance of today, Christian homeschooled. For the most important lesson of the day was the first, when I would wait at the foot of the stairs with my siblings, waiting to see our father come from his bedroom, attired for his day at the office. And when we saw him so, we raced for the family sofa, calling dibs on that portion of the sofa that was between my father's bed and the arm of the sofa. We called that prize spot the cubbyhole. And there, each and every day, our day began with Bible devotion. Then, my father off to work, our lessons were taught to us by my Aunt Anna Bullock, my mother's sister. She lived with us, exchanging room and board for teaching us children our lessons. I was good in some subjects, literature, history, natural science, very poor or average in other subjects like mathematics and Greek and Latin. But it was natural science that was my greatest joy and pleasure. The study of birds and the woodland creatures. My parents introduced me to nature even before I could go outdoors in my father's library. For it's there that I discovered John James Audubon's Birds of North America, Dr. Livingstone's Explorations of Africa. I would point to the pictures of the creatures and beg the adults to read me the magical words below. When I myself was old enough to read, I would spend the day reading and then spend the night pestering the adults with questions about the implications of what I'd read earlier in the day. My parents did indulge me when I was old enough. My brother Ellie and I and our Roosevelt cousins who lived next door, we would go out around the parks of New York City, nearby Gramercy Park, Mr. Olmsted's great Central Park, another of our playgrounds, and even the American Museum of Natural History. Oh, it's grown since I was a boy, but it as well was one of our playgrounds. And if you look in its collection, you might know, of course, about the great Hall of African Mammals, mostly harvested by me and Kermit in 1909 and 1910. But down below, an Egyptian plover that I shot along the Nile when I was 13. And even deeper in its recesses, some birds' eggs and mice skeletons donated by one young Theodore Roosevelt of 28 East 20th Street. And all along the way when we were out, we collected snakes and bugs and turtles and birds, squirrels and rats and mice, alive or dead, it did not matter. We brought these creatures home and had on the 4th floor of our home something that we called Roosevelt's Museum of Natural History. A very wide-ranging, though as any mother might suspect, a truly malodorous collection. You had to be careful coming to my house. If you poured yourself a glass of water from the pitcher, a snake might fall out of the pitcher and into your glass. If you reached into the icebox for a snack, you might pull out my collection of mice awaiting my experiments. One afternoon, I was walking up Broadway Avenue. I saw Mrs. Hamilton Fish, wife of the United States Secretary of State, walking down. A very important lady. I thought if I had some display of gentlemanly conduct, that a report of my gentlemanly conduct might go home to my mother, much to my own benefit. Pride before the fall. As I passed Mrs. Fish in the street, I tipped my hat and wished her a good day. And when I did so, 2 frogs fell out from beneath my hat and fell upon her shoes. And I'm afraid that the report that went home was not of my gentlemanly conduct. I was tutored for my entrance examination to Harvard College, today Harvard University. Perhaps there's a future member of the Crimson student body amongst us today. I did not learn much of practical value at Harvard. Most of my classmates majored in the issue of nightlife across the Charles River in Boston. But my own father had sent me from New York City to Cambridge my freshman year with these words. He said, "Theodore, first, take care of your morals. Second, your health. Third, your studies." My father was the only man of whom I was ever really afraid, but in a good sense of the word. I never wanted to disappoint my father. I graduated 4 years later, Phi Beta Kappa, magna cum laude. That means I did quite well in school. My father visited me my freshman year and asked me that question that perhaps many of you have asked of a student away at college, or you in turn will be asked by your parents someday soon. He said, "Theodore, what do you plan to do with yourself professionally?" I said, "Father, I think I should like to be a natural scientist." He said, "Theodore, that's fine, as long as you are not a dilettante, as long as you do serious work." The family had done well enough in business that my family eventually would not need to worry about its bread. "If, however, Theodore," my father said, "you have a taste for jam and butter, you had better get about the plan for the jam and the butter." My father taught me in this issue of home economics, if I wasn't going to do remunerative work, that is, work for pay, if I wasn't going to add to the value of the numerator of life, I must reduce my expenses and thereby reduce the denominator of life and keep the fraction of life constant. My father was my dear heart's companion. In our family, we called him Great Heart. Are any in the younger generation anymore reading Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress? Second best-selling book in the United States in the 19th century, following the Bible itself. Great Heart leads Christian and other pilgrims past places with which you are familiar. Vanity Fair, from which the magazine derives its name. The Slough of Despond. And the place with the men with the muckrakes in their hands, where men are so busy raking up the muck and mire of human existence, they fail to look up and see that salvation is offered before them. Hence the phrase I coined during my presidential administration, the muckraking press. I was not paying a compliment to the yellow journalists of my day. My father died quickly and suddenly of stomach cancer my sophomore year. He but 46 years old. The entire city of New York was in mourning, and I was in a terribly foul mood, writing in my diary and to my siblings that I thought I might go insane from sadness. My tutor, Arthur Cutler, knew that in the past, being outdoors and having strenuous exercise had not only restored my health as an asthmatic, but also my spirits. That summer, he sent me to the north woods of Maine, to the great Aroostook country along the Penobscot River. There I hunted and hiked and canoed. We climbed Katahdin, the highest point in Maine, famous today as the northern terminus of the great Appalachian Trail, upon which I hope some of your feet tread someday. We visited the lumber camps, where my vocabulary was greatly expanded. And each and every morning before we had our adventures, I took my own canoe to a place south of Island Falls, Maine, a place where the West Branch of Lake Mattawamkeag River is joined by First Brook. And there, in the early morning lights, by the sound of those waters joining gently, I began each and every day, as my late father would have me do, with Bible devotion. In the years hence, the people of the state of Maine have seen fit to name that little point of land a state historic site called Bible Point, so named for the fact that I, as a young man, sought and found the wisdom, comfort, and solace of the good book there. My spirit somewhat restored, I returned to Harvard, threw myself into my studies, but as many a young man of that age is wont to do, I fell in love with young Alice Hathaway Lee, the most beautiful girl in Boston. She was 17 years old at the time. The cousin of a classmate of mine, they lived as neighbors some 6 miles distant from Cambridge on Chestnut Hill. In my junior year, well-worn was the pathway between Cambridge and Chestnut Hill. So much so that in the spring of my junior year, I proposed marriage to Alice, and she refused me. In the fall of my senior year, I proposed marriage to Alice again, and she refused me again. But it's doggedness that does it. Persistence wins the prize. Oh, today you might call it stalking. In the spring of my senior year, Alice made me the happiest man in the world, relenting to my proposals, agreeing to be my bride. I do understand that occasionally a married man has trouble remembering the date of his wedding anniversary. I took care of this. Alice and I were married on my birthday, and we honeymooned but briefly. I knew that a man's first responsibility was to pull his own weight, to provide for his family, but I'd soured on natural science as a profession. It was an era of microscopy. A natural scientist was supposed to be a man indoors in a laboratory, looking through a microscope and doing dissections. Nothing like the great outdoor field work with which I'd fallen in love. I enrolled in Columbia Law School, thinking to follow 2 of my late father's brothers into the practice of law, and soon became doubly frustrated at law school. Each and every day, walking between home and Columbia Law, twice each day, I passed the local Republican headquarters. Not surprisingly, above the local saloon. And much to the horror of my family, I inquired about becoming involved, was embraced by the young men there. They ran me successfully for the New York General Assembly. I was elected its youngest member at the age of 23. And as I left for Albany, New York, the state capital, to take the oath of office, the erroneous words of one of my cousins were still ringing in my ears. He said, "Theodore, don't you understand the Greek etymology of the word politics? Poly meaning many, and ticks being blood-sucking insects." Off to Albany I went, and soon there I was known as the Cyclone Assemblyman, the man with the sun in his face. In 1883, when I was elected to my 3rd one-year term, despite still being its youngest member, I was run for the speakership, a position that you've held, Madam Secretary. Now, it was a foregone conclusion in my case. The Tammany Democrats were in the vast majority. But I became the Republican spokesman at just the time that the future President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, the former mayor of Buffalo, became our Democratic governor. So the dust-ups were written up as being between the Cleveland Democrats and the Roosevelt Republicans. It was also then that I received a horrible telegram in Albany that sent me for the train, on the train down the Hudson Valley, racing to my family home, where my brother Elliot answered the door with these words. He said, "There is a curse upon this house. Mother is dying, and your wife is too." On the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, 1884, my dear sweet widowed mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, the Rose of Roswell, Georgia, she died of typhoid fever, the dirty water disease, and that night in my arms, beneath the same roof, my dear sweet bride Alice, she but 22 and a new mother. She died of Bright's disease. That's the kidney disease, now quite treatable by modern medicine. There's nothing in my diary that day but a large black X and the words, "The light has gone out of my life." I thought forever. A friend wrote of the twin funeral 2 days later, "Theodore knows neither what he does nor says." But I was a man of faith, and my faith told me my loved ones were not gone, but gone before. And I took courage from the words of my late father, who said, "Dark care seldom sits behind the rider whose pace is swift enough. Get action." Action I got. I had the newborn baby named Alice for her late mother, cared for by my sister Anna, known as Bammy in the family. I returned to the state capitol in Albany and threw myself into the work of my legislative committee, some nights spending the night sleepless, turning out 7 or 8 handwritten bills a night. The session over, I returned to New York City, saw to family affairs and baby Alice, took the train west to Chicago, participated in my first Republican National Convention, leading the effort successfully to see the first man of color, Congressman John Lynch, a former slave of Mississippi, seated as a temporary chairman of a great National Party convention. The convention over, I did not return east to New York City, but took the train so much further west to where the newly constructed Northern Pacific Railroad crossed the Little Missouri River in the Badlands of what was then Dakota Territory, where the previous fall, in the after excitement of a successful bison hunt, I'd written a check to purchase 450 head of cattle and to hire men to be my cattle ranch foreman. I was now a cattle rancher. Ha! If you think those rough and tumble politicians of Albany, New York thought me a strange fellow, and they did. Imagine how the cowboys and ranchers of the Dakota Territory regarded me when I got off that Northern Pacific train. I was not of their kind. I actually carried and read books, had and used a toothbrush. My glasses were some sort of sign of a moral defect in a man's character. They called me storm windows and four eyes, but never to my face. Only Mr. Roosevelt. I had one distinct advantage. I was the cattle rancher. I owned the cattle. The cowboys worked for me. And I earned their respect by working alongside them. When they were in saddle, so was I. Sometimes riding the trailed herd at the most monotonous of paces, 16, 18 hours a day in saddle. Then to be greeted by sudden excitement as we stopped stampedes or raced the herd across rivers brimmed with running ice. When I went to the Badlands, it was still the Wild West, the West of the Indian and the buffalo hunter, the soldier and the cowpuncher, the West of Owen Wister's stories, and Frederick Remington's and Charlie Russell's paintings and drawings, a West where I could ride for days and not even see another soul, the game and wildlife staring silently as I rode by. I slept at night with nothing but a billion stars for a blanket, woke in the morning to the smell of sage in the air. 'Twas not all romance. We knew toil, hardship, hunger, and thirst, working beneath the blazing summer sun and with the bitter bite of winter in our faces. We saw men die violent deaths amongst the horses and the cattle and in evil feuds with one another. But ours was the glory of work and the joy of living as free men on the cattle range, the beat of hearty life in our veins. I would later tell the people of Fargo I would have never been president but for my experiences in North Dakota, that it was where the romance of my life began. And later at the White House told Colonel Fall of New Mexico, he a veteran of Cuba, that if by some strange magical charm you were to take away from me every memory of my lifetime and vouchsafe me but one, the one that I would choose to retain would be of my time as a cattle rancher along the Little Missouri. It's where I learned about my fellow Americans, especially the men and women who by the labor of their hands and the sweat of their brows did the great building of this country. I would write my sisters in New York City, bragging that I was as hard and as brown as a hickory nut. Returning to New York City, as I frequently did, to see to family affairs and to avoid some of the bitterest of the Dakota winter, in my letters I instructed my sisters that when I visited, under no circumstance should an old childhood sweetheart, Edith Caro, be anywhere about. Oh, I was a Victorian. I did not approve of second marriages. I did not want to be tempted. And thank goodness, sisters don't always do what brothers ask them to do. On one return visit, there in the parlor was Edith. We began to see each other socially, became secretly engaged. And nearly 3 years after my first wife's sad passing, Edith and I eloped and were married at St. George's, Hanover Square, London, England. Returning to the United States, 9 months and 2 weeks after the wedding, Ted Jr. was born. The first of 5 children that Mrs. Roosevelt and I would have together. We took the baby Alice back into our care when she was but a toddler, breaking my sister Bammy's heart. Fast forwarding through history as we must, this beautiful morning in Salem, I wonder if you realize in later years of the White House, Mrs. Roosevelt and I reared 6 children there. Mrs. Roosevelt claimed she reared 7 children there, and that I was her largest and worstest child. Oh, I worked hard for the American people, for what I called the square deal. And I said, when you work, work hard. When you play, play hard. When you work, don't play at all. But when the work day was over, I played hard. I did not have a kitchen cabinet of informal advisors like President Jackson. My informal advisors were known as members of the tennis cabinet. By invitation at the end of the workday, members of Congress, diplomats, Army and Navy officers would come to the White House and we would play lawn tennis on the south lawn of the White House, right where Mrs. Taft installed the Rose Garden. In the White House, I boxed with Army and Navy officers and with former heavyweight champs like John L. Sullivan. I wrestled jiu-jitsu and sumo with great bare-chested men brought over by the Japanese ambassador. And I played single stick, a wonderful game where men beat each other about the head with a giant wooden fence post. Great bully fun. The game I enjoyed most, though, was an outdoor game, a hiking game, a game that we called point to point. A game we played with the Roosevelt children and their cousins at our home Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, now a National Historic Site ably administered by the Park Service. The way we played point to point in Oyster Bay was to first spin a small Roosevelt child around at point A, And wherever that dizzy child came to rest and pointed, beyond the horizon was some imaginary point B, towards which we raced in single file. The rule being that whenever you came to an obstacle, a downed tree, a creek, a fence, a cliff, a barn, a haystack, you never went around the obstacle, but always and only over it, under it, or through it. Oh, it makes for great dirty fun. We should play it here at the Capitol. I imported this game to Washington, D.C., and played the game with members of Congress and diplomats, and with Army and Navy officers that showed themselves entirely too unfit physically to keep up with a fat, asthmatic president racing through the woods. The most famous of my point-to-points in Washington, D.C. was in the company of the French ambassador, Jean-Jules Jusserand. You'll find his monument in Rock Creek Park. And it was there that we went for a hike, first riding our horses, but I'd noticed that the French ambassador had disregarded the part of the invitation that said, "Wear your dirty clothes," for he was wearing the finest French silks of the French court, through which, by the end of several hours of hiking, he had sweat through. We came to the Potomac. It was in freshet, and this day being a very wide, deep, and fast-running portion of the river, the French ambassador looked greatly relieved. He thought certainly we'd be returning to the White House for some well-earned refreshments. But I turned to the gentleman with me, and I said, "Gentlemen, let us take off our clothes, put the bundles atop our heads, swim across the river, put our clothes back on dry, and continue our hike on the cliffs opposite." Can you imagine such a thing today? I think CNN would go live from a helicopter. As we entered the water, I saw that the French ambassador, while he had disrobed, he'd kept on his lavender kid leather gloves. I said, "Mr. Ambassador, why have you kept on your gloves?" He said, "Monsieur President, that's in case we meet any ladies." I don't think any president ever enjoyed himself in the White House as your president as much as I did. And certainly no family ever enjoyed themselves more than the Roosevelt family. 6 children, most of them small. The head White House usher for decades, Mr. Ike Hoover, he wrote of the Roosevelt years, "It was no time for a person with a nervous constitution to be working at the White House." The older boys pretending to be jack-in-the-boxes, they would jump out of giant vases just as startled visitors walked by, or come careening down the staircase on cookie trays stolen from the kitchen. My daughter Alice was 17 when we entered the White House, and her behavior was scandalous. Alice smoked cigarettes in public. She flirted with Army and Navy officers. When the White House punch was discovered spiked, we knew who the culprit was. Alice kept a snake in her purse and introduced the snake as Emily Spinach at diplomatic dinners and receptions, sometimes wearing that little green snake as a bracelet around her wrist or a necklace around her neck. Oh, I tried. I put my foot down. I said, "Alice, no daughter of mine will smoke beneath my roof." Alice was often seen smoking on the White House roof. During one afternoon conference with an old friend, Alice continuously and exuberantly interrupted. Finally, in exasperation, my friend said, "Mr. President, can't you control your daughter Alice?" I said, "Sir, I can either run the country or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both." Alice was married at the White House to Congressman Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati, Ohio, the Longworth House Office Building in Washington, D.C., his namesake. The wedding was a great success. Perhaps your grandparents played the song Alice's Blue Gown in the parlor. The color Alice Blue, popular for decades in women's fashion and home decor. Well, the wedding was a great success. The marriage was a challenge to all parties concerned. Alice outlived all of her younger siblings, living to the age of 96, well into the administration of President James Earl Carter. And I do believe her personality delightfully summed up by a needlepoint message that was on a pillow on her settee. The message on the pillow said, "If you don't have anything nice to say about someone, come sit next to me." Contrasting sophisticated Alice on the other end of the family spectrum were the youngest boys, Archie and Quentin, 7 and 4 years old when we entered the White House. As the boys grew, so did their mischief. They and their friends, known as members of the White House Gang, so named by the members of the Washington, D.C. police force and the Secret Service, who were so often the targets of their shenanigans and their spitballs. One story illustrative. In the middle of winter, after heavy midwinter snow, I left the White House for an appointment. I ascended an open-air carriage. As I did so, one Washington, D.C. police officer gave me a crisp salute. And as the tips of his fingers hit the brim of his helmet, so did a giant 30-pound snowball drop from the White House roof. The snowball smashed through the officer's helmet and left him knocked out cold in the driveway. I did not need to investigate. I turned to my shoulder and said, "Boys, get down here immediately." Down the little ones came. They apologized profusely. They meant to frighten us for fun, not to harm anyone. I did look into the issue, and I discovered that officer was long overdue for a promotion. There was a night when the Taft and Garfield boys came to the White House for a sleepover. Every parent and grandparent knows a sleepover is a good time to post extra guards. I drank 1.5 gallons of coffee each and every day. I was normally the last guard awake at the White House. I read 1 or 2 books each and every day, often walking the hallways late at night reading, as I was this night of the sleepover. I was reading The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Somewhat appropriate material given the boys sleeping over. And I was on guard for some sort of Tom or Huck-like mischief, and there was something afoot. I just could not put my finger upon it. But then I realized, as you know, the White House is a wonderful museum. A treasure trove of portraits of presidents and first ladies adorn the walls. And there is something truly hideous when spitballs have all been placed for their eyes. I woke the culprits, and they spent the wee hours of the morning cleaning off those portraits. And in the words of diplomacy, the Taft and Garfield boys were persona non grata at the White House. They could not come and play for at least a week, for I could not have done without their company any longer. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, whether I was in the company of a dusty diplomat or a member of Congress, I would excuse myself. It was children's hour. Out into the yard to play with the children, or in the wintertime, up into the attic to play amongst decades of White House treasures and the White House rats. In the attic, we played bear. Oh, I am a most ferocious grizzly bear. The children running about, half in terror, half in delight. Playing bear one afternoon, I was just about to pounce upon my prey when one of the boys turned off the lights. The next thing to be heard was a loud thud, and then my crying out, "By Godfrey, turn on the lights." The boys turned on the lights and saw me leaning up against a post. I was holding my head, covering my eye, a small trickle of blood coming out below. Sticking out from the post at eye level, a 4-inch nail. It had just missed my eye. Quentin was quite the quipster as well. He pointed out that it was fortunate that it had, because otherwise I would have been old 3 eyes. The children enjoyed themselves in the White House in great part, for the Roosevelt White House was a veritable zoo, a menagerie of animals, like you, cats and dogs, perhaps horses. But I wonder if any of you at home has a pet badger? I do not recommend it. Our badger Josiah did terrible things to the people's furniture with its 3- and 4-inch claws. We had a 1-legged rooster, a parrot that on command shouted, "Hurrah!" for Roosevelt. The boys played with snakes and would lean over a balcony and drop a snake onto the lap of a congressman waiting outside my office. Oh, I normally didn't protest. Given the characters in Congress, this was something akin to a family reunion in some cases. Oh, I don't mean to offend your modern sensibilities, but of course, in my day, the House, the Senate, they were dominated by special interests on Wall Street, working hand in pocket with members of Congress. Perhaps I'm not offending your modern sensibilities on this point. There were so many investigations of corruption in the United States Senate that I said when they called the roll in the Senate, the senators didn't know whether to respond present or not guilty. It was a wonderful life at the White House. A delightful time for the Roosevelt family, but as my son Quentin has pointed out, one cannot live in the White House for forever, though Cousin Franklin tried. We let go of the White House and life there in March of 1909. I was, of course, an accidental president, come to the presidency through the graveyard. In 1900, I wished to be elected to a second 2-year term to the New York governorship. It was as governor that I first declared for the square deal. I was fighting against corruption and the Republican bosses. Well, in the tradition of the New England mother. You know the New England mother who had 2 sons. One went off to sea. The other became vice president of the United States, and neither was ever heard from again. So it was those bosses that sent me away to the vice presidency. Senator Mark Hanna, McKinley's mentor from Ohio, the Republican national chairman, not supporting my nominations, telling his fellow Republicans, "Don't you realize what you've done? That madman cowboy is but one life from the presidency." And how sadly prophetic his words. President McKinley shot on September 6, 1901, while greeting visitors at the Pan American Expo in Buffalo. I raced to be by his side. As the cabinet assembled, after a few days, his physicians assured me and the cabinet members that he would recuperate from his wounds. The cabinet felt it would do the nation's anxiety and Wall Street's anxiety some good if I was seen to go on a planned vacation with my family in my beloved Adirondacks. I climbed Mount Marcy, the highest point in New York, and the little bunnies played in the headwaters of the Hudson River. But word came that McKinley was failing in Buffalo. Unfortunately for President McKinley, the 2 physicians treating his wounds were both obstetricians, neither of whom had ever treated a gunshot wound in his practice. I raced down Mount Marcy in a rainstorm, and on the morning of September 14th at North Creek Depot in the Adirondacks was informed that en route, President McKinley had died. I was now your 26th president. I raced to Buffalo, paid condolences to Mrs. McKinley, and then in a private residence, now a National Historic Site, the Wilcox Mansion, I had to borrow a suit and a top hat. I took the oath of office without a Bible at hand, simply stating that it would be my aim that the policies of the McKinley administration for the peace, prosperity, and honor of the American people would remain entirely unbroken. Now, I hope that there's something of my legacy that you still appreciate. I mentioned Crater Lake National Park and our 3 national wildlife refuges. A dozen of your national forests were named or combined or expanded during my administration. I did not think, however, that was my greatest accomplishment. I reserve that for a bit of ditch digging down in the Isthmus of Central America, the Panama Canal. A vision of mankind since the explorations of Balboa 4 centuries before. Completed in 1914, it cut to 1/3 the amount of time necessary to move our great naval assets from one ocean to the other. For it was during the Spanish-American War that your namesake battleship, the USS Oregon, stationed in San Francisco, it took 66 days for that ship to make it all the way around the Southern Cape and make the end of the war in Cuba. Not unrelated, the steaming around the world of the Great White Fleet, 16 battleships painted white, the color of peace, and in circumnavigating the globe, accomplishing what no Spanish, Dutch, or English armada had ever accomplished before, and demonstrating to the powers of Asia and Europe that the United States Navy could do in peacetime what might be necessary to do in wartime. The Nobel Peace Prize, awarded to me for settling the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, probably saving over 100,000 lives between the two combatant countries. The Medal of Honor, awarded to me posthumously for the action on Kettle Hill that July 1st, 1898. And all of it, perhaps, so much dust in the windy streets. The Pure Food and Drug Act, federal meat inspection, railroad rate regulation, the Intercoastal Waterways Commission, the Newlands Reclamation Act, damming 30 western rivers and irrigating millions of previously arid acres and providing for the settlement thereon by farmers and ranchers. Perhaps all of it being forgotten and receding into the background. Perhaps the youngsters would agree that I'm actually best remembered not for a legacy of success and achievement, but for the legacy of a failure. Oh, I'm not speaking about the 1912 presidential campaign, how I wish Oregon would have joined Washington and California in voting for me, but you quickly run out of the states that did so. Wilson ran the table with Taft and I splitting the vote. No, I'm speaking about a legacy of failure from a bear hunt in Onward, Mississippi in 1902. When I refused to shoot an adult male bear that had been wounded by the hunting dogs and tied to a tree. One in my hunting party said, "Mr. President, there's your bear. Go ahead and shoot your bear." Oh, what a cowardly and despicable thing that would have been to do, to shoot a wounded and tied animal. I had founded Boone and Crockett, the nation's first fair hunting and conservation organization, a decade and a half prior. I refused to shoot that bear. The story spread throughout the country, embarrassingly so, and the cartoonist Clifford Berryman, hearing that story, drew a cartoon of the incident and called it Drawing the Line in Mississippi. His cartoon, however, showed me refusing to shoot a small bear cub tied to a tree. And so many Americans believe that this story involves a bear cub. When I returned to the White House, I received a letter from the Mictum family. They were small candy makers, toy manufacturers in Brooklyn, New York, eventually the Ideal Toy Company of New York City. Mrs. Mictum, in her letter to me, asking permission to make a stuffed bear and to name it after me. I wrote back. I said, "You may go ahead and do so, but I don't think it will help your sales very much at all." I wonder if any of you have known the love and comfort of what then was called Teddy's bear, with the apostrophe possessive S. Do any of you still have your teddy bear? Oh, up with your hands. It's not just the ladies, right? Real men have teddy bears. There you are. I see some of you ladies have married your teddy bears. That's the way that works. The toy manufacturers, enthused by the unexpected profits that came from the sale of Teddy's bear, they thought they might equally profit if they made a stuffed animal and named it in honor of each and every subsequent resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. But I'm afraid in honor of William Howard Taft and for the toy manufacturers, America's mothers never really took kindly to putting Billy the Possum in with the children at night. The teddy bear reigns supreme. And if I may, today we've got this particular teddy bear. Oh, he's been bouncing around Oregon with Mr. Timchick and I. And something tells me that on a nice ranch in central Oregon, perhaps there's a great grandson that might enjoy a little Teddy. Welcome. And a real Secretary of State Quano to her Deputy Secretary. Your name again, sirs?
Which one?
Mr. Vile, Deputy Secretary Vile. To each and every one from the Capitol building that's make us welcome today. And normally I'll zoom all about, but they told me we were on TV today, so they told me to stand still. It's not an easy thing for Teddy Roosevelt to stand still. But I'll do so long enough to answer questions, take your comments. I was the first president to make permanent office space available for members of the press at the White House, something I'm sure many of my successors deeply regret. But I would be remiss if I didn't take a question or comment, especially from the young scholars here. I hope that you might be studying me a bit in your studies, maybe the progressive era, gunboat diplomacy, poppycock, anything that you might like to discuss. Please, sir, thank you.
Mr. President, in 1907, when you sent the Great White Fleet around the world, did you imagine or envision that the United States would one day be fighting wars in those oceans through which that fleet passed?
Of course. You may know that when I, as Vice President, Labor Day 1901 at St. Paul, not knowing the fate that would befall McKinley 5 days hence, when I quoted the old African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far," I was commenting on the United States Navy. The statement in Africa, of course, meant that a man might literally travel from his tribal region to and through other tribal regions and do so peacefully as long as he spoke diplomatically. But it helped if he had a big stick and looked like he knew how to use it, too. The big stick was the American Navy, forward deployed. And if you've been familiar with the work of Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, the influence of sea power on history, he had demonstrated that every great power fell when its navy fell into disrepair. We had come upon the world stage defeating the Spanish monarchy for the freedom of the people of Cuba by annexing and having territories in Puerto Rico and Guam, the annexation of Hawaii, the purchase of Alaska. The century from our founding to my presidency, the century and a quarter, we'd filled in the continent. We were now, I think in our future, more a Pacific nation than an Atlantic nation across the old country. But it was, I think, amongst the greatest responsibilities that I had to build a modern American Navy that could be the equal of any other Navy, perhaps not realistically the great British Navy, but if we had that special relationship that we forged, if we could make sure that in case of a war with Japan, Britain might remain neutral rather than honor their agreement to fight with the Japanese. Well, it was the Navy that was going to protect our sovereignty as a bi-coastal nation exposed in each of those coasts to the European and Asian powers that might contest us. What I did not foresee, of course, sir, is that if we'd fight a war, that we'd still be there as we now are in Afghanistan. Is it now 15 years, 16 years that we're going on in Afghanistan? We went into Cuba. We trained, shipped to Cuba, fought in Cuba, returned to Montauk Point, Long Island, were quarantined and mustered out, all in less than 6 months. We occupied Cuba, had to send the Marines again in by request of the Cubans in future years, but we weren't there to raise the American flag in perpetuity. We were there to help put the Cuban people on their own feet, to let them fly the Cuban flag. So I do lament that while it's important that we are stationed on behalf of ourselves, our interests, and our allies around the world, I lament that sometimes these wars have gone on a bit too long for the good of all involved. Anyone at all? That was a wonderful question to start the Q&A. Maybe someone would just like to box or wrestle. Gifford Pinchot, the national forest, we give Gifford Pinchot credit, and it's due there. The first time when I was governor of New York and Pinchot came to the executive mansion to discuss some forest good, he came around the corner and saw me in a third-floor window lowering my children out of a window on a rope made of bed sheets, for we were under attack by Indians. Before we did our forest good, we went to my office and pushed the furniture to the sidewalls. We rolled out a wrestling mat. I proceeded to box and wrestle with the forester Pinchot. He was a tall Yale bulldog with a long reach. For the rest of his career, he bragged that he knocked the future president off his pins. But I ask you, who do you think won the wrestling match? So if you don't ask any questions or comments, we might have to go outdoors and have a bit of a scrum. Anyone at all? Please, madam. I'd like to correct that record a bit. I was a Victorian. It was very important that if we weren't familiar with one another, we would properly address one another by surname. I was generally called Mr. Roosevelt. Of course, when I held the governorship or the assistant secretaryship of the Navy, Mr. Secretary or Mr. Governor would have been sufficient. However, I've got all sorts of records of correspondence where perhaps like with the hunting guide Noah Lacoste, the Quebecois man that took me up to the top of Mount Marcy, he attested in his letters that he called me Teddy and I said that that was just fine. And also, I was a politician. If the people were shouting out for Teddy, they were probably voting for me. But of course, we're generally more accustomed to formal address. You're all on a first-name basis now, even with people you don't know, aren't you? But I think it's nice to have a little bit of formality. So I would prefer to be called Colonel. That was informal enough for me. But the country called me Teddy, and it generally worked out pretty well. Good point. Anyone at all. The youngsters, young people, you're not going to let the seniors do all the question asking, aren't you? What school do you come from? Are you all from the same schools, visiting from the same program? Is there a spokesman amongst you? A chaperone?
Right here.
Oh, all right. The SL, is that your school?
No, this is actually a Korean baseball team. We have visiting Korean guests from Daegu.
Wonderful. Welcome to our guests from Daegu. From the Republic of Korea.
The Republic of Korea, yes.
Delightful.
This is an exchange program, and they're here for the week, and today's the field trip down to the capital.
Fantastic. And teacher, thank you for the work that you're doing. Well, I might not expect a really tough question from our Korean guests, but perhaps... and all right. Mr. Timchuk keeps the trains running on time here. Let me conclude then, especially for our guests from Korea and for all of our friends who've come and joined us today. Some words that I shared with the French at the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, in 1910. I made a speech there called Citizenship in a Republic, and that might be something that you'd like to read. It's a small portion that remains famous, and I give you these words of encouragement, for I know that many of you are doing good deeds for this country, good deeds for your country in Korea, good deeds for education, conservation, the arts, historic preservation, and more. Well, at least here in America, we know that no good deed goes unpunished. No good deed goes without its second-guessing, its Monday morning quarterbacking, its criticism. Please, good people of Oregon, persist in your good deeds. And when you're criticized, remember, it's not the critic who counts. It is not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man and today to the woman who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, who spends herself in a worthy cause, and who, in the end, at the best, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, that his name shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. We've all known victory, we've all known defeat, we're all human, we all prefer the former over the latter. But I've shared some of these stories with you with great purpose, and do so especially with the school children who are still waiting for us this day. What if as a little boy I'd allowed myself to think of myself and define myself as a weak and sickly invalid, instead building my body and living the strenuous life outdoors? What if as a young man I'd allowed those horrible tragedies to limit, define, and envelop my life, instead going to the Dakota Territory, healing, getting back in the family way, 17 grandchildren. Madam Secretary, when I was a young man, I ran for the mayorship of New York. I came in third out of 3. That's last place. What if I had given up on politics and public service after such a humiliating defeat in my home city? I would have never been your president fighting for the square deal. The reason why, by the way, the artist Gutzon Borglum says, I'm atop Mount Rushmore with the other 3. Have you seen me at Mount Rushmore? Oh, I'm rather stone-faced there, aren't I? Instead, come join me next summer up at Theodore Roosevelt National Park in the Badlands. We're going to build a presidential library there. Are the Newells, Tom and Cece Newell, are you here today? The Newells? You've got relatives, Dorothea, your cousin, and her husband, Jeff. They're friends of ours. We've cruised to Cuba, and we hope that you'll come and join us in the Badlands of North Dakota. All together, how about 3 cheers for Oregon? Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Godspeed, good people, and thank you for coming to the state capitol this morning. Fully, fully.